um prazer estar aqui, nesse que é o meu segundo festival. A Marina Walker Guevara tem um papel muito importante, além dos prêmios que ela ganhou, ajudar a desenvolver uma cultura de colaboração em larga escala. Como citado, foram mais de 300 jornalistas participando de projetos como o Panama Papers. E aqui ela vai poder fazer uma apresentação bastante detalhada a respeito das técnicas que foram utilizadas em alguns dos trabalhos mais recentes, né? Porque ultimamente ela tem se dedicado nessa interseção entre o que é o Big Data, né, e o que são as tecnologias de Machine Learning, buscando esse desenvolvimento do jornalismo profissional. Então, ela preparou uma apresentação especial para cá, para a gente, para o Festival Piauí. E vamos começar com isso, depois eu e o Dorrit vamos fazer perguntas. E ao final, nos últimos 10 minutos, vamos transmitir as perguntas da plateia. Tem uma pessoa aqui também que está a postos para receber esses questionamentos por escrito, por favor. Muito obrigado. Marina, palavra com você.
Thank you so much, Breno. Thank you, Dorrit. It's just like an amazing opportunity to be here with you today. Brazil has always been part of the work that I have done for the past 20 years in collaborations, and it will continue to be the case. And I am just so happy to be here for the first time at Festival Piauí, to be able to discuss with you some of the biggest questions facing our industry. And I want to start, if my slides are ready. Let's see. Okay, works. So as some of you know, collaboration has anchored my experience and my career and has allowed me to do things that I never thought were even possible. And speaking of impossible ventures, I would like to start with an anecdote from another discipline that has resonated deeply with me as I reflect about the challenges and the promises that journalism faces in the time of AI chatbots. So on April 10, 2019, astronomers at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics declared at a press conference, "We have seen what we thought was unseeable." They were referring to the first ever photograph of a black hole, something that until that point had been considered impossible to accomplish because scientists would have needed a telescope the size of the Earth in order to see a black hole. So instead, 200 scientists, we just talked about 200 journalists, in this case 200 scientists, joined forces and created a network of synchronized radio telescopes that were set to focus on the same object at the same time and act as a giant virtual telescope. The more telescopes involved, the sharper the image. As the New York Times put it at that time, the scientists had to adjust the telescopes to work together. They had to get the timing right. They had to hope that the weather would cooperate in multiple places at the same time. And oh yes, they also needed the good luck that nothing broke. It seemed crazy, but it worked. So now let's think about journalism and how that kind of cooperation and ingenuity grounded in trust and a little bit of crazy has allowed us to overcome our limitations, break new ground, and tackle stories that we thought, like I did, that would be just impossible to do. As we sit here today in Sao Paulo, some of you might be feeling that the whole AI in journalism challenge is our own black hole kind of moment. AI is a complex, fast-evolving, powerful technology with the potential to change the lives of people, millions of them, for good or for really bad. I like this image, this next image, because in its simplicity, it summarizes a lot of the concerns that AI generates. The author of this image explains that what we are seeing is a computer scientist. The algorithm she created has jumped out of her computer, and she worries about what harm the algorithm might cause in hospitals, schools, and police departments where that algorithm is going to be deployed. Just like it's happening as we speak, in Sao Paulo. Maybe you have your own set of concerns regarding AI, and some can be very personal. Maybe you feel that there's a lot you don't know about this technology, or maybe you think that your lack of a technical background doesn't position well to investigate AI or to use AI. Or maybe you, like me, are completely put off by the hype and the doom and the doom and the hype that seems to dominate media coverage of AI. So here's the good news. I bring you a message of encouragement. We are all on the same boat. This is complex and messy work. Complex and messy, and we need to be able to be comfortable in that complexity and that mess. And it's developing fast in front of our eyes. It's also exciting work. It is kind of unavoidable work, and yes, we cannot dodge the AI wave, nor do we need to, or nor do we want to. Instead of that, and to ease the anxiety, let's use the lessons from the past for the future. Once upon a time, we were all lone wolves. I think a lone wolf inhabits in each journalist's soul. It takes more or less space depending on the journalist. But we were all like that at one time, and then the internet, organized crime, technology advancement caught up with us, and we realized that we needed a radical change in the way we were working, because we were missing the most important stories of our lives by being lone wolves. Enter the networks of collaboration, the methodologies that change us through and through as a profession. There are some very serious holdouts, but for the most part, it changes through and through. And some of those stories really did change the world. This is one of my favorite collaborations of the early days of collaborations. And it's when Ukrainian journalists and volunteers, so collaborating across disciplines, literally fished out documents that former President Yanukovych and his inner circle had disposed of in a pond of the presidential palace before fleeing the country for Russia. Lam, she spoke this morning, would love this, that of course after they fish out the documents, they scanned them and created a database that was the source of important corruption stories about the Yanukovych presidency. So going forward, we need to understand AI, we need to investigate AI, and we need to co-opt AI for good in journalism. And to do that, we are going to need some of the same ingenuity, radical sharing mindset, and thinking outside of the box approach that fuel all of us who went from lone wolves to collaborators. Today, collaboration is the new normal. We no longer question it with the passion that some people questioned it in the early days. And that is because we have the principles and the methods, and we have enough examples of success to know that this works. And the examples of success come from many of you sitting here also in this room. So how do we feel, how do we build the same confidence for the field of AI in journalism? How do we turn that into the new normal? How do we spread the news that just like no journalist can ignore the climate story because it definitely touches your beat, no journalist can ignore the AI story because it has already transformed your beat. Whatever you cover, economics, hiring, politics, or the criminal justice. For investigative journalists, the challenge is twofold, is to hold AI accountable and to co-opt it for our own work in an ethical manner. A quick example from my own experience at ICIJ. I am not a coder or even a data journalist. I am a regular editor and a manager. My first encounter with AI was about 8 years ago at ICIJ when we were trying to wrestle to the ground a database of millions of documents that later became known as the Paradise Papers. We had a problem of volume and a problem of consistency. Millions of documents, some of which were very valuable and insightful, and some of which were like literally trash. Like, where do we go for lunch tomorrow or something like that. One particular kind of very valuable document, and this is going to be the second most boring piece of information you hear today after Lamb's noise example. So the one very valuable document was called loan agreements. Those loans were proxies for all kinds of dubious money flows and payments. So we wanted to separate all of the loan agreements from the maze of other, millions of documents. The problem was that these agreements, they were not all the same. Otherwise, you could have just looked it up, right? Like do a search in a search engine. They all looked different. They had different language, and sometimes they were disguised. They made them look like something else. So you couldn't just search for them. Our data team, what they did is they used a subset of AI called machine learning to teach the computer the range of possibilities of what a loan agreement could look like. Common keywords, formatting, and other features of these documents. And then they set the algorithm free to go and find other documents that match that description of those parameters. This is how a classification, let me see, let's go back. Oh, I missed one of my, okay. I missed one of my favorite slides, which is a donut and a bagel. I don't know where it went. But
maybe it's a little late.
Is it later? Okay. Okay, so a classification algorithm works like this. Is this a bagel or is this a donut? Is this a loan agreement or is this something completely different? It seems so routine and so boring, but it was so incredibly useful, and it allowed us to go. And I think I also missed another here's my donut and my bagels. And here's my next slide. So by doing that model, it allowed us to go from chaos to pattern to story lead. From chaos of millions of documents to a pattern of loan agreements to a story lead. And the story lead was a very important one of the many story leads that we found. And one of them was about Glencore, one of the main extractive companies in the world, and how they had loaned tens of millions of dollars to a very unsavory partner who was helping them negotiate access to mines in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I think I might have Glencore here. Sorry, it's hard to know what's in the world behind me. So I will come back to co-opting AI for investigations, but first just some quick reflections on our other responsibility of holding AI accountable. And to me, we can't use the technology the way that I just described and the many other ways that journalists are using the technology if we don't first develop a critical thinking about what the technology is, what it can really do, and what are some of the unintended consequences of that technology. So probing AI is a reporter's unavoidable responsibility, and because of all these reasons. And I will just comment on the first one. It's everywhere. AI has become infrastructure, just like the internet. And because of that, it's invisible. We don't even have time to count all the places that AI is making decisions in our daily lives and in the lives of many other people. And I would also comment on the third one. It is so not often designed with the most vulnerable people in mind. Those people that are going to be most affected by the technology are not obviously at the design table, at the decision table, but they are also not even part of testing protocols sometimes. So who advocates, who works on behalf of the most vulnerable, who holds the power accountable on behalf of the most vulnerable is you, right? It's journalists. And finally, it's an extremely secretive and proprietary technology. Just a few weeks ago, this meeting is one of many meetings that have taken place in the US Congress between big tech and US senators. All these meetings are closed doors, no press allowed. Closed doors, no press allowed. In the meantime, there was a recent study by researchers that evaluated. They said, fine, maybe they're talking something very important that we shouldn't know. Let's see what is the transparency of the algorithms themselves. And all the bigger companies got an F, a really bad failing grade. There is no transparency. and that is on purpose. So what do we do? 3 things. First of all, shake out the fears. Shake out the fears. You are doing this whether you want it, you like it, or not. And you are not delegating it to the tech desk, and you are not delegating it to the business people in your office, in your newsroom. Because if you do that, then you become the next Rolling, what is it, not Rolling Stone, what is the magazine that just had the big flop with the invented lamb? Sports Illustrated. Then you become that, right? If you remove the journalist, if you remove the editorial criteria and control from the decisions of how we're going to understand, cover, and use AI in our newsroom, you become the next Sports Illustrated. So what we do need to do is to understand the basics of what an algorithm is and can do. And then we do what we always do as journalists. We document the opportunities and we document the harms. And to document the harms, there are like helpful questions that we can ask ourselves if you're thinking like, how do I even start? Then you can start by asking yourself and your sources and your editors these kind of questions. Who's paying? What process got automated? Who's benefiting? What do the makers of the technology say that the technology can do versus what is the technology actually doing? What might be unintended uses of the technology? Here's a very quick and awesome example of a really great use of reporting on AI by a Dutch newsroom. Gabriel Geiger is a fellow at the Pulitzer Center of our Fellowship for AI Journalists. You are all invited to apply and to be part of this community. So Gabriel and his team at Lighthouse Reports and Wired, what they did is they interrogated an algorithm that was being deployed by the Dutch government to help them supposedly fight welfare fraud. And AI companies are going all over the world to all governments, including this probably, in this country, and telling them, you are worried about waste? You are worried about fraud? We have the solution, AI. It will help you select and identify the fraudsters. So Gabriel and his team, through FOIA, Freedom of Information records requests, and through really great data analysis, were able to obtain what we call the Holy Trinity in AI reporting. That is the model file, the full algorithm, model file, the full algorithm, and then the data that was used to train the algorithm. So the full picture they were able to obtain through this public records request. And when they analyzed it to see how it was designed and who was being harmed, they found that the algorithm was giving a worse score to people by discriminating by gender, by age, by parenthood, and by ethnicity. So if you were a single mom and you didn't speak Dutch very well, language was used as a proxy for ethnicity. As far as the algorithm was concerned, you were a fraudster, and you were set to be investigated, or worse, to lose your benefits. As Gabriel's story shows, this is a profoundly human story. So it's about real individuals in real communities experiencing a very specific harms, not doomsday futuristic harms that are going to happen in 1,000 years, and we don't even know if that's going to happen. So I invite you to practice human-centered AI reporting. I'm finishing soon. It is our responsibility to find those people affected by the technologies through court cases, through advocates, through patient groups, and more, and to center them in the stories that we are writing about AI. So if you start fretting about like, how am I going to write this technology I don't have a tech background, then you say, well, do I have a people background? Have I covered affected communities in the past? And if the answer is yes, then you can be an AI reporter. And the third advice, here's how the algorithm works. See, here are the scores. If you were a parent, if you were not a parent, see, this is how your score went up, right? If you were in the red because you had weak Dutch skills, then you bad, right? Bad to not speak well, bad to be a woman, bad to be a single mom. Then you're a fraudster. Third advice is to get out of your bubble. this is a cross-discipline and a cross-border story. So we're not going to solve it in our own isolation, in our own newsroom. We're going to need to reach out to others. And one of the reasons to reach out to others is because AI companies are not being kind to journalists. They have never been bothered or asked questions before in the manner that they are being asked questions now, and they don't like it. And we have experienced libel lawsuits in the US against journalists who dare question the algorithm. And in the US, we consider there is a pretty safe space to do reporting in the public interest. And these journalists are spending their time defending themselves in courts. So we are going to need to bulletproof our reporting, and when we don't know something, we're going to need to find that computer scientist, find that person in civil society, that lawyer that is going to help us understand what we don't know and bulletproof the work. Did we say follow the money? Yes, follow the money. I want to show you a story by Karen Howe, is one of the pioneers of AI reporting, and I hope you listen to her talks and you read about her, Karen Howe. And Karen did this wonderful project for the Pulitzer Center called AI Colonialism, where like she followed the money, and what she did is like she reconstructed, her thesis is that the AI industry is reproducing the patterns of the colonial history that we have. So an algorithm that is built in Silicon Valley, basically the supply chain travels the world. It can be tested in South Africa. The data labelers that are called, that are the ones that say donut or bagel, can be based in the Philippines, and then the algorithm finally sold and deployed in a completely different country. And that's why I said before, you know, we need that cross-border perspective. And finally, there are stories that are of hope, and this is in her series, this was a story of hope, where she found an indigenous community, an indigenous couple, whose mission was to save a language, an indigenous language that was dying, the Maori language. And what they did is they turned to machine learning to teach the computer what that language, through the work with elders and oral history, what the language looked like, sounded like, so it can be preserved and taught in the future. So this is AI for good. And we should, as journalists, also put the light on these kind of stories when they emerge. And we, as the Maori community, we can find a way to use the technology also in our work to augment the journalism that we do. In journalism, going back to how we use it in our profession, we use machine learning when these things happen. When the data is too messy, when we feel like this, and believe me, we felt like that in Panama Papers and many of those other big investigations, when there's no consistency, and when it would take forever to tackle the data or the story with human means. So journalists have turned, again, chaos, pattern, and story lead. Journalists have used the technology to do all kinds of these things, and we can talk more in detail, to follow the money, to reveal underreporting of crimes by police, to analyze millions of contracts and spot corruption. And the final one that I have listed there, to expose environmental crime. And that is an example that you're going to learn a lot about tomorrow, because the author of this amazing example is Joseph Polisuk, who's one of the speakers at the festival. But I just want to give you a very quick overview, because we work together, and I'm so proud of Joseph. He did all the work. The very genius thing he did is that he understood that to solve the journalistic problem that he was trying to solve, he needed the help of this technology. In this case, what he wanted is that the machine recognize and classify something much more interesting than the loan agreements that I was trying to classify. He was looking at the Amazon in southern Venezuela. And he wanted to map comprehensively the criminal infrastructure that allows for the extraction of natural resources, specifically gold, from the Amazonian in Venezuela. So he wanted the machine to help him classify the illegal airstrips. Something has to come and something has to get out, and the only way to do it, or one of the major ways to do it, is through the air, and then the gold mining sites. So we got together. We realized we had a lot of issues to sort through, but we matched Joseph with computer scientists. We went out of journalism, and together they were able to locate and identify, he will tell you more about this case, more than 3,000 mining locations, and that is around the size of 40,000 soccer fields, by the way, many of them close to clandestine airstrips. The stories were published in Armando Info, the outlet he founded, but also in El País. And most interestingly, it inspired the New York Times. I love when a small outlet in Venezuela inspires the New York Times. And The Intercept, which is another really weird thing that happened. The New York Times and The Intercept worked together on the story. Have you ever heard of such a thing? It happened. I can talk about it later if you want. So they worked together, and they were able to expand that methodology to the Brazilian Amazon. So now we were able to map all the illegal airstrips and the gold mining sites in the entire Brazilian Amazon. And then the Pulitzer Center created an app that is called Amazon Mining Watch. You can search it, and that mine allows you to see, to do your own research and to find all these locations of these mines and these airstrips for your own work. So we want these methodologies to be replicable, to be able to use it in more than just one case. And I am finishing. All I want to say is that it's incredible to think that all these innovations and learnings have happened at the time of so much upheaval and so much suffering in our industry and also in the world. And yet, there's an apparent great momentum and a synergy of people, of ideas, and of methods. So what is going on in our profession as it confronts the AI challenge reminds me, let me just go to the last slide, reminds me of this, of those scientists, right, trying to coordinate their telescopes from different corners of the world to finally see what was unseeable until that moment. Remember, the more telescopes involved, the sharper the image of the black hole, as long as there was discipline, coordination, trust, and yes, a little bit of luck. So I'm counting on all of you, on all of us, on these communities' ingenuity and courage to give us a sharper image of the journalistic principles that endure beyond technological revolutions, a deeper conversation about the role these technologies can play in strengthening or dismantling our democracies, and bolder ideas about how we might create a more equitable and inclusive field of AI reporting. So here's to hoping that we continue to reach for the impossible and the unseeable with new tools, deeper determination, and more collaboration. And thank you so much for listening.
Marina, muito obrigada por essa exposição. Eu acho que falo não só em meu nome quando eu digo que a sua clareza diminuiu consideravelmente minha ansiedade profissional em relação a essa caixa preta que é a inteligência artificial. Se eu tivesse algumas décadas a menos, eu acho que eu sairia dessa apresentação e iria me inscrever num curso de aprendizado mais profundo dessa nova tecnologia. O exemplo que você deu, esse mais recente da Amazônia, é assombroso, porque, de um lado, ele é empolgante pelo resultado que surgiu da ideia inicial de um jornalista, e na outra ponta eu imagino que, ao final do trabalho, novamente entram em cena o jornalista para fazer uma revisão final, para não termos a impressão que estamos sendo substituídos pela tecnologia. Por outro lado, esse exemplo é desalentador, porque expõe cruelmente a ausência de documentação e data confiável do crime amazônico na Amazônia brasileira, e o governo já poderia estar fazendo isso, e coube a um jornalista venezuelano detectar as minas e os campos de pouso. É inacreditável. Então, estamos todos de parabéns nesse sentido. Você fala muito num tripé que, pelo que eu entendi, é a base da sua segurança ao lidar com a inteligência artificial e num trabalho colaborativo, que é justamente confiança, cooperação, trabalho coletivo e tecnologia. Nos papéis do Pentágono, eu queria que você falasse um pouco sobre essa questão da confiança, porque papéis do Pentágono, não, perdão, Panamá e Paradise, vocês lidaram com uma papelada altamente sensitiva, sujeita, em caso de algum erro maior, a uma quantidade de processos judiciais intimidadora, porque vocês tinham, então, 300 ou 400 repórteres apurando e levantando coisas cabeludas, e, ao final, se um erro maior fosse detectado, a judicialização seria monumental. Em todos os países haveria alguém que poderia recorrer e silenciar, nesse sentido, através de processos e mais processos, silenciar todo um trabalho. Então, essa confiança, pelo que eu lembro da perna brasileira dos Panama Papers, os repórteres envolvidos não falavam sequer para seus consortes em casa sobre o que estavam apurando. E, ao mesmo tempo, vocês tiveram de entregar esse material valioso para cientistas da computação, engenheiros, técnicos, que não faziam parte do seu FIEF, do seu grupo. Como que você chegou a essa confiança?
Thank you so much for that super key and perfect question. Before I address trust, I just got this image in my head when you said we had to avoid mistakes. It was just such high stakes, right? And I remember my boss used to come to my office throughout this year and a half that we're investigating, and he would say, like, he would do this. We had like this code, and it was like, one mistake and we're done. It was like, just one mistake and we're done. And it's true, right? Like it was like the biggest disclosure, one of the biggest disclosures of information to journalists at the time. It was an incredible exercise of trust by the whistleblowers, who until then, the whistleblowers have always existed. And of course, we remember WikiLeaks and so on. It wasn't the first time, but it was really massive. And in terms of this particular story, it was the first time. It was going to be like the biggest disclosure known about a secret world. And it was going to be the first attempt to bring so many journalists on board to work on this together. And why did we do it? Like, could we have done it with, like, instead of 300 with like 20? Would that have been easier? I think we wanted to prove the point that the collaborative methodology could work on a global scale. Because we knew that if we could prove that, that can be a game changer for journalism. We didn't want to have another small example. We wanted to be bold. Why? Because the data was bold, because the findings of public interest in the data involving prime ministers and princesses and queens and celebrities, they were big. They deserved all the risks that we could take as a consortium. So how do you build the trust? Well, the trust cannot start to be built the minute you realize you have a big story like that on your lap. The trust is building communities as part of your reporting. And I think that Lam also mentioned that this morning. you need to find your tribe, you need to find your community, the place that you belong, the people that you trust, the people that have the similar mindsets to you. And that's what we silently built. Like the consortium started in 97. This story came out in 2016. So all those years, we were doing significant, important work, nothing of the scale of Panama Papers, but what we were doing was like quietly creating the conditions for world-changing journalism. And that meant training the journalists, identifying who were not only the most thorough and driven reporters, but who were the best collaborators. And that's not something that we realized like that. We made many mistakes. At the beginning, we were like, who are the best journalists and the most famous in their countries? And you know what? We went through hell with the famous ones, with the divas. Like I can still, so my boss, again, like he used to call it, my family suffers of this disease or cancer, so I don't want to, make an example that, but he called it our cancer days because it was just so difficult that he said, this is going to end up killing us. And that's when we made that click and we said, this has to change. We cannot work with brilliant jerks, right? We would need to work with brilliant, amazing human beings. And for that, you need to be intentional about finding them, incorporating them, and diversifying our network around the world. So that's what we did. So we built this trust, a smaller story through a smaller story, project after project. So by the time Panama Papers came around, there was a community. There were like understood principles of support and collaboration and confidentiality. And yes, when we felt like we were working on something that had been confided, like there was a trust again that the whistleblowers put on us, that we couldn't, if we broke that trust, if one of us spoke a little bit too much at a bar, at the newsroom, that can have consequences not only for the story, for the world, but also specific consequences for journalists in Russia and in other difficult places that can be, harmed.
Yeah.
So those were the kind of stakes. And then individual journalists made really important sacrifices for the sake of the story and the trust. And one that I want to highlight was our colleague Johannes in Iceland. If you remember, the Prime Minister of Iceland had to resign 2 days after the Panama Papers. So that was one of the highest stakes stories we had. Johannes works at the public television in Iceland. And he realized after we called him and he saw what was in the database, that he was not going to be able to hold that job at the public television, even though it's an independent public television, but it's too small of a country, right? Yeah. It's like I think it's like fewer people than in Sao Paulo. So he said, I can't do this. I have to go home for the next 16, 17 months and do this story in isolation. And I have to do this for the team, for the story, and for my country. So without telling anybody, but I think one person, he resigned. Everybody was like, what are you doing? You're one of the most better known journalists. Why are you going home? He went home without a salary. And he stayed without a salary until, I think, 2 weeks before publication, he came back, brought everybody on board in the TV, and they had this incredible, and you may have seen or remember the videos when the Prime Minister basically runs away from the interview and goes in and hides in the bathroom. Was one of the iconic moments of the Panama Papers. Johannes told us later that what he did to survive is by Christmas time, he just had no money. And so the only safe job he could do was to write a newsletter for a local parish. So he got a little bit of money to write newsletters for a local parish while he was investigating the Panama Papers with no salary in his home.
Well, bom, dos méritos então foi manter os jornalistas de bico fechado, né, durante, porque somos uma classe que está muito afeita sempre a conversar bastante, a discutir bastante. Marina, tentando conectar um pouco, né, essa experiência dos grandes projetos de colaboração com o momento que se apresenta, né, essa realidade atual em que a inteligência artificial já está presente na vida das pessoas, às vezes de uma maneira não muito perceptível, mas uma pergunta tentando conectar as técnicas de aprendizagem de máquina, né, com esses desafios mais monumentais de trabalhar com base de dados tão gigantescas? Quais são, na prática, as técnicas, ferramentas que você sugeriria que fossem utilizados, né, para quem quer explorar, né? Quem, como a Dorrit falou, quiser sair daqui e pensar como aprender a dominar não só esse leão, mas o leão, a girafa, todos os animais ali que compõem o caos da sua apresentação. Então, de que maneira surfar essa onda? Né?
So there is no magic recipe, and we talked this morning about some of it. Like there needs to be a basic literacy in data, and again, like the time where you could say, oh, somebody else is going to do the data. We all need to be proficient, at least on spreadsheets, to be able to understand the basic infrastructure of how data fields relate to each other. I don't think that that's something that can be relegated anymore into other people. So one of the first things I would do is to if you've never done data, if you don't know how to handle a spreadsheet, which is understandable, and like a lot of us are like that, or we're like that, you start by taking those small steps. Start reading Lamb's book, taking a course on pivot tables and other data journalism approaches that can be really helpful for things as simple as analyzing a budget and seeing like how it has changed over time. I would also say, as we said before, associate yourself with those who know more than you. So if your newsroom already doesn't have technical capacity, and I would expect that most newsrooms, of course there's a huge, challenge of business and so on, and it's expensive, but there are smart ways to create partnerships with universities, with research centers, and that's what we usually do. That's what we did with Joseph on his story on the Amazon. We did not have at the Pulitzer Center a machine learning specialist, but we learned about this organization called Earthrise Media. They just changed their name, and I forgot what the name is, but I'll find out for you. But it's a bunch of data scientists whose job is to help journalists apply machine learning on environmental stories. And the good thing about these partnerships is that often the scientists, they have the tools and the methodologies, but they don't have the real world examples. They have not been like Joseph had been in southern Venezuela and understood that geography, understood the criminality, the criminal groups that are involved. They don't have that experience. Joseph is a traditional journalist, and he didn't have all the tools and all the knowledge that the scientists had. But he knew enough of the basics of AI concepts to know that regular data journalism on a spreadsheet was not going to help him solve the problem, that he needed more computing power, that he needed to look at things from the sky. So how do you look at things from the sky? Through satellite imagery. And so then he went and just asked the right questions. So a lot of this basic literacy allows us to write questions from people who know more in these fields and that are happy to connect with us in most cases and collaborate on the stories. So I would say that those would be the approaches and the things that I would do. And of course, if you have the inclination and you want to teach yourself coding and you want to do it, like anybody who can do it should go for it. There's a proliferation of machine learning courses. In the internet, there's one course that the Knight Center for Journalism in the Americas is teaching right now about using machine learning in journalism. And so many of those courses are free. And then at the Pulitzer Center, we can also help you, like if you want to do that you want to hold AI accountable and you want to learn to report on AI better, we are creating cohorts of journalists, a network called the AI Accountability Network, where we're bringing together journalists from all over the world who are solving together the challenge of how do we access the data, how do we ask the tough questions, how do we protect ourselves from lawsuits, and how do we report the stories like the Netherlands story that I just showed you.
Marina, o grosso da sua carreira e experiência e sucesso está vinculado a um jornalismo investigativo em rede colaborativo. Mas como E você insiste que isso passará no futuro a ser o novo normal do jornalismo, que deixa de ser o lobo solitário que compete com o vizinho e quer dar furo todo dia. Agora, a realidade, pelo menos no Brasil, ainda está muito longe disso, até porque depende de empresas comerciais de mídia e são muito diferentes e têm interesses e soluções diferentes. Isso aqui está meio me afogando, mas tudo bem. Você tem exemplos que possam nos ser úteis? Quais são as redações na Europa ou nos Estados Unidos que estão mais avançadas, redações convencionais, tipo o New York Times, que consideram abrir a sua maneira de exercer a profissão de uma forma mais inteligente e colaborativa, sem desvirtuar a natureza básica dela?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. And I have to say, several Europeans have been ahead of the Americans. It was hard to introduce the concept of collaboration, and in some ways it's still hard in the US. There were stories written about this, that the New York Times was not part of the Panama Papers, and the ombudswoman of the New York Times, I remember she called me and she's like, how come? Like, I have the readers like calling me, I have hundreds of emails, why we were not part of this? And my answer was like, because you were making things so hard for us. And the story that we were doing was too big. Like, we didn't have time to answer your questions, right? And that was not like arrogant on my part. It was kind of showing like, we tried so hard. We waited in your lobby for so many times. We were looked down a little bit on kind of like the crazy journalists in the nonprofit world. And at some point, so we needed to find partners we could trust. And so we found, in this case, we found partners in a news wire service called McClatchy, a media group in the US, mostly because they own the Miami Herald and a couple other good places, but mostly because we knew the reporters there, and the reporters, like, we trusted them. They were hungry for collaboration, for putting a lot of work into the work into the collective. And so, yeah, that's what we need.
Yeah.
Like, we don't have time for politics. For the following investigation, the Paradise Papers, the New York Times sent a delegation of journalists to our newsroom in Washington. We no longer had to do the pilgrimage to New York and wait in their lobby. They came to us and we had a conversation, and they were part of the collaboration under the terms of the collaboration. And then they ended up writing an op-ed called "We Have 400 New Friends." And the 400 new friends were the reporters around the world. I think that when you are trying to convince your corporate owners of your media organizations about about collaboration, talk in the language that they understand, and the language that they understand is business. And so what you can show is examples from The Guardian, from Le Monde, and other media organizations around the world that routinely are part of large collaborations. And those collaborations have meant more subscribers, more support, and in many cases more trust from their readers. I caught a newsletter or an internal message from Le Monde that showed how they convince, how they invite new subscribers, and one of the things that they highlight is you will get access to global investigations and stories of the size of the kind of the Panama Papers. So they are still using that kind of information as a way to entice their readers. And we saw in the case of the New York Times that the readers were angry when they had to go, when they had a subscription to the New York Times, but they could see nothing about the Panama Papers there. So talk to them about those benefits, and also remember that there's something very funny in journalism, which is, we call it FOMO, and it's fear of missing out. We all have it. If you don't have FOMO, I don't believe you. Like, we all have fear of missing out, right, in journalism. So your bosses also have fear of missing out. They don't want to be the one media that wasn't part of it, because they're going to get asked questions by some of their bosses. And so tell them, these, and these are already part of this investigation. If we don't jump on board, then maybe these other competitors in our own market are going to be invited. So you can decide, like, do you want to be part or you don't want to be part? And they can make the decision.
Yeah.
It was difficult to find partners in Brazil. I love Brazil. We have a grade of individual reporters that are fantastic, that work with us in every single investigation. At the Pulitzer Center, Brazil is one of the biggest countries we support. But for the global collaborations with commercial media, it was a lot of that pilgrimage of suffering and pain and begging, and then at some point deciding to work with nonprofit spaces or other newer digital outlets that have understood the value of collaboration, both the editorial value and the business value. And piauí has been one of those. They are part of the consortium, and so that is a really happy news to share.
Marina, você tem uma frase que é: você não confia nos veículos de comunicação, você confia nos jornalistas. Queria que você pudesse desenvolver essa leitura também, como se aplica no seu trabalho até agora.
Yeah, I don't think any of us trust the media.
Repeat that. Repete isso bem alto.
Sorry?
Repita.
I don't think we trust the media. Well, we need, as journalists, right? Like, we need to be radically independent, and that means being also radically independent of media power. We are not our employers.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the most beautiful things I have seen in collaborations, it has been reporters being able to, in some ways, have bigger loyalty to the story than to their corporate owners. In some cases, they have let us know when they are under pressure. So they trust us, and they say, like, listen, this story about the business people in my country is getting a little bit harder to get prioritized. They're happy to do the stories about Putin and about, the church or whatever, but the businessmen. And so that valuable information allows us to then reach out, in kind and non-threatening ways, and find ways to get the stories out. Another tactic that we use is to, when you have a big collective, to not have just one media in a particular market, but to have 2 or 3, so they can be each other's controllers in some way, and know, and especially if you pick, for example, one commercial paper, one nonprofit media, and a radio station or something like that, and with different backgrounds, different audiences, and different commercial or no commercial interest at all. And so that's going to, by itself, create, facilitate or make sure that no story is going to be censored, because they would look bad, right? They would look bad if the other outlets publish them and they hide it. And so we can do things like that. But we always, when we start a collaboration, and I recommend that to you, if you have, and it doesn't have to be hundreds of people, it can be a collaboration of 7. Find your reporter match. Find the people that you are gonna be spending 100 million hours with in this collaboration first. And then together, talk to the bosses. Don't go first to the owner or the boss or the big editor and have that person assign somebody to join your collaboration, because then you don't have any control over who, and you might end up with a brilliant jerk. So you identify the trustworthy, awesome, great digger person, and then together you advocate with the bosses. This is what we wanted to do. Do we want to miss out, or do we want to be part? And there might be cases in which the editors say, we have other priorities. Maybe we have a bigger story, so we're going to miss out on this one. And that's fine, as long as there's like that frank communication, I guess.
Você é a favor de uma regulamentação do uso de inteligência artificial por cada órgão de mídia, ou pelo governo, ou por governos estaduais, uma legislação qualquer municipal, federal, ou da própria indústria de mídia? por onde começa a regulamentação, ou deve começar?
I'm not a complete expert or an expert on everything that is going on with regulation, and of course there's a rush to regulate now, especially in the north. And the problem with that rush is that whatever decisions are made there in those closed doors, no press rooms that I mentioned, is probably going to be copied later in the global south in countries like mine, like Argentina. Because we often don't create our own legislation from scratch, right? We take notice from somebody else.
Yeah, sure.
And so that is a problem. Yes, regulation, in my view, needs to exist. Right now, most of AI is unregulated, and that's why we're seeing the excesses and the abuses that we're seeing. Who needs to be regulated? The makers of AI, the buyers of AI, and the governments and the corporations that deploy AI for things like hiring people, for things like deciding who is a fraudster, who deserves benefits and who needs to be cut out, or for deciding who is a criminal, who shot the gun. In the US, there are AI companies that work with police departments that use AI technology. They use the sound, not even the image, and they match the sound of guns to a collection of sounds.
Wow.
And then they decide it was your gun. You were the one who killed the
fantastic.
person. And there have been big mistakes in that, or situations in that technology that has not been accurate. So yes, regulation, we need to be covering what is happening with regulation. Do we know if there's any attempt at regulating here in Brazil? Do we know which Brazilian agencies have automated their processes and bought algorithms? Do we know who is selling those algorithms to Brazilian agencies? Is it Israel? Is it the US? Where are they coming from? Are there public tenders? That would be a good way to start. Like, what public tenders are there soliciting algorithms for various things? So those are all these kind of questions that we need to ask. But in terms of like how do we regulate it in the journalism industry, I don't know if the government regulation should include us, but what I do need is that we need to regulate ourselves. And there are a lot of efforts going on around the world to create guidelines, and companies themselves, media companies, have created their own guidelines. I was just recently part of an effort by Reporters Without Borders to create a charter of AI in journalism. You can look it up online, and it basically describes like the steps that and the guidelines that we should observe for an ethical and safe use of AI in the newsroom. One of the main things that it says there is that the use of AI in the newsroom should be human-centered. That, as you said, Dorrit, that the human need to be part of the beginning of the process. What tools are we going to use and why? Of the implementation, how bad it is, what the algorithm is spitting out, and then of the correction.
Yeah.
How do we edit and verify and control the output before it reaches the public? And one interesting conversation we had in the charter, and maybe you have different opinions about this, was that at some point the charter kind of, the conversation was along the lines of like, well, if the media organizations use AI and there's a problem with AI, whose fault is it? And then I said, in my view, we take the fault. If you decided to use AI in the newsroom and you didn't fully understand the technology, or you took it at face value from the companies that it was 90% accurate, which is, please distrust those kind of figures, because they throw them out all the time and they rarely show the data to back it up. So when somebody tells you the algorithm is 90% accurate, first of all, whoa, like 10% bad? Imagine if the decisions that the algorithm is making is like who goes to jail, and 10% bad is like, so, and then ask, what is the data that backs it up? Usually they don't give it to you because they say it's proprietary. And I lost my train of thought, but I guess I was saying, we need to take responsibility. If we decided to use it and something goes bad, that's part of the game, right? So we take responsibility, and we have a conversation with our readers from day one of the decision to automate a process. We tell readers, this is what we are doing. This is what we are. This newsletter was first summarized by an algorithm, and later it was edited by human beings. That would be the kind of disclosure that I think would be ethical to include.
Marina, uma das coisas mais fascinantes na inteligência artificial que a gente vê atualmente é essa capacidade de gerar conteúdo, né? Ela não apenas é o que se fala, né, que seria AI, Generative AI. Não apenas fazer esse resumo das informações, compilar, apresentar, mas também já foram noticiados casos em que artigos acadêmicos foram escritos, assim, ou pelo menos esboços de artigos acadêmicos, gerando citações que não existiam, na verdade, né? E pensando do ponto de vista do jornalismo, né, a desinformação é um problema gravíssimo e nos últimos anos a gente viu, né, o uso do fact-checking para combater esse problema. E agora, essa nova realidade dessa inteligência artificial com capacidade de gerar conteúdo, acho que traz ainda mais desafios. Então, eu queria que, se você puder explicar um pouco, né, de como, o que pode ser desenvolvido no universo do fact-checking para lidar melhor com essa situação, quais têm que ser as prioridades das agências que seguem trabalhando no tema, né, para se antecipar, né, e não ficar tão a reboque dessa tecnologia que vai avançando.
It's a $1 million question. One of the biggest worries with generative AI is deepfake videos, of which we already have seen many proliferate related to the Israel-Hamas war and others. I think it's important this interdisciplinary approach that we were talking about, as costly as it can be, and it's not as costly as you may think. We need to incorporate those skills in the newsroom. You need to have in the newsroom people who are experts at what Henry and others here in the room are experts, open source investigation techniques. These are the folks that can quickly analyze video, that can look at the metadata, and that can tell you fairly quickly, like whether something has been doctored, whether something was done 3 years ago and is presented as fresh news. So I would say, first, slow down the process. In this environment, we are going to need to put safeguards if we don't want to be the next Sports Illustrated or worse. We're going to have to reinforce that human in the loop at all times of the process, and then have the expertise in-house, because you're not going to be able to send maybe you can send the video to your friend in the university if you have no other alternative. But we should start forming our own journalists with these techniques so they can be our safeguards in the newsroom, so everybody can have eventually, my view is that everybody should be, just like everybody should be a climate reporter. Does that mean that you report about climate all the time? No. You have enough awareness and literacy to understand how climate influences every single bit and aspect of human society.
Yeah.
And the same with AI. Every reporter should be an AI reporter. Does that mean you report about AI all the time or write code? No. It means that you have enough literacy, awareness, and basic knowledge to be able to act on cases like this, or know what questions to ask and who to ask those questions to, so you don't fall into those traps.
A gente está se aproximando agora dos momentos das perguntas do público. Dorrit, se você tiver alguma para fazer agora, ou se não,
não.
Tá legal.
Pode ir indo.
Bora, depois a gente volta. O Júlio César faz a seguinte pergunta. A inteligência artificial é uma ferramenta muito importante para o jornalista, mas gostaria de saber a sua opinião sobre o programa israelense Pegasus, que espionou muitas pessoas pelo mundo inteiro. Existem outros também, né, além do Pegasus.
Mas é o mais conhecido.
Então acho que vale para citar também esses outros recursos semelhantes.
Surveillance technologies are intimately connected to the development of AI. They are powered by AI. The city of Buenos Aires, that people who have been there recently, they say, it's so lovely, it's clean, it's not falling apart despite the politics. It's also like 80% of the city of Buenos Aires is now surveilled. So the chances that your picture is going to be taken and processed are like so high, right? And those are all AI systems that then connect your face and your image with other databases. And sometimes what happens makes mistakes, so-called false positives. We have a case in Argentina that some of our reporters wrote about, where a person was in jail for months after being snatched in a train station and accused of a crime because of this faulty facial recognition technology. Pegasus is, as we know, developed by a government. So like the stakes are even higher when these technologies are being weaponized against vulnerable groups and for anti-democratic initiatives and values. Let's look at what is happening in El Salvador. So let's look at what happened just recently in the Philippines. This, again, weaponization of security, or in the name of security, infringing every single civil right and privacy right. So I don't know that I have an opinion on this. What I would say is that we need to understand that that's going on. We need to understand that we journalists are vulnerable, that we need to have a very disciplined digital hygiene, weird term, but to be aware that we can be targets of that surveillance, that we can be spied on, that governments and other actors are happy sometimes in the name of something else to make us targets. And let me give you an example from the US. One of the AI fellows did a story about an AI technology that was sold to colleges and campuses in universities in the US. And the technology was supposed to help colleges understand from social media, from the students' social media, how cases where students might be at risk for suicide or like deep depression. Interesting, and I could see how maybe that could be, there have been a lot of, mental health has been a big issue around the world after COVID especially. Dozens, if not hundreds of colleges bought this technology. And then remember we talked about the unintended uses of AI? So you know what they ended up using the technology for. They ended up using, these colleges have police within the campuses. There's the campus police. So the campus police was part of these conversations and these contracts. And so they were like, oh, gee, just like we watch the social media accounts to see who might be feeling sad, maybe we can look at the social media accounts to see who might be feeling too rebellious and might be organizing a protest in campus. So they turn around the technology to instead systematically monitor protests in campuses and to be able to anticipate them, cancel them sometimes, or send a ton of police to the protest, even though it was like, very pacific, peaceful, regular protest. So that is what worries me when we think about Pegasus. It's like, it's not just, we all can be, our children can be targets of this kind of, and these are the stories. What an amazing story to tell, right? Because that could have been a positive story of AI.
Yeah.
To say, and I bet half of us would have written that story unknowing to us, without knowing. So what a great journalist. How he was able to realize what the real story was? Because through records request, what he requested, he said, oh, they're not going to give me the algorithm. But the public universities, they are subject to FOIA, to records request. I can ask their emails with the makers, that all the contracts and the emails. And in one of the emails, one of the uses, they were like, you can use, these are the uses you can for this technology, mostly for the suicide prevention, all that. However, you might also consider using it for, and then describe these other
Yeah.
more nefarious uses. And so that was what triggered the question, and then he started to investigate and ended up coming up with a bunch of evidence.
E esse é o exato ponto da pergunta que a Mariana fez também, né? O desafio de saber fazer uma pergunta correta do que perguntar, né? A pergunta da Mariana é em que você deve se concentrar para poder decidir exatamente quais são as questões certas. Entendeu a pergunta? How to make the right questions. Quais são os pontos que você
it's
tem?
going back to the basics of journalism. And maybe if we have the slides, I can go back to the slide that where we had the questions. But the basics of questions of journalism is like
Do caos para uma ordem. Eu acho que é um pouco isso que você...
But what are the questions that we ask ourselves when we investigate this technology? And sorry, this is going to take a while. Just a second. I think it's just the next one. Okay, there we go. So what process got automated? Who is paying? Who is benefiting? The third one is really important. What data is the algorithm learning for? From all the reasons that we discussed this morning. Because data is people. Data is not a neutral space created by some sanitized robot. It's data is people, and it involves the human biases of people. And there's data that is being, quote unquote, polluted by decades of bias. And so if we're going to make the decision of who deserves parole in the US, in the prison system, and the data is skewed against black people, then what are the chances that the algorithm is going to recommend that black person who had exemplary behavior and so on deserves that parole? Probably zero, right? And the question that we just ask ourselves now, they say they are using this technology for this. Are they using it for something else? Who do we ask these questions? We ask this question to advocates in the civil space. We look at lawsuits as well, because there are like privacy groups and others that are starting to file lawsuits on behalf of citizens. We ask the government officials that are deploying the technology, and it's really funny because sometimes they are as weird out as we are. They are like, oh, well, you know, we were given this system, and half of us don't understand what's going on, but you know, and they're willing to show you, like they're still a little bit unaware of the risks of giving you access, and so some of them might be actually willing to show you how the systems work, or talk a little bit about how they are struggling to understand it, which is also part of the story. So I think that these are some good examples of questions.
Estamos bem pertinho do fim, mas a Dorrit quer fazer uma última pergunta?
Não, não é nem uma pergunta respondível, mas só para me situar um pouco nesse buraco negro. Em que fase você acha que essa tecnologia está hoje? Nos primórdios dos primórdios, em algum meio de caminho, a evolução hoje em dia já é possível de ser programada, ou ainda estamos muito aquém de entender qual vai ser a chegada final?
Great question. Lam said this morning, like, this technology is being discussed and developed since the 1960s. So it's really important to take that historical perspective. This does not start last year or 3 years ago. What has happened, especially in the most recent couple of years, is that there has been a jump, and the biggest jump has been in computing power and the amount of data that the systems are able to digest with that computing power, which has exponentially increased compared to previous years. What is hard so two things, it's not as invincible and as good as the companies want to believe us, make us believe that it is. So always important to remain very skeptical and don't buy into this kind of AI invincibility or AI inevitability proposition. We have lived before without this. It's here to stay, but let's question every single statement that we get from the companies about the accuracy and the powers, about the sentiments and the feelings. There is no feelings, there is no sentiments. Computer systems don't have sensory, perception. The comparisons with human intelligence are very flawed, and so also very careful to not fall into that trap of comparing human intelligence with technology, with computer intelligence too freely. And we can start by not the way that we represent a lot of the stories about AI, because remember, AI is invisible. So what happens on the visual departments? If there are visual editors here, it's hard to illustrate. So what's happening is that 90% of the stories about AI are illustrated with robots, or with half robots, half humans. So if you take away one thing from this whole conversation, it is that never again illustrate a story about AI with a robot, with a human hand.
Good.
Or a human hand. And instead, I'm going to give you a resource, which is called, it's a wonderful organization, an online database called Better Images of AI. So every time, and those are curated by wonderful interdisciplinary teams, and those are images that are free to use, that for one, they include the humans at the center of the AI systems. And so we don't know how much more there is to come, but what we know what we can do today.
Great.
Senhoras e senhores,
Great
essa
ending.
foi Marina Walker Guevara. Muito obrigado. Um prazer.
Querida.